During a real estate transaction, what costs are included and who should pay for them? Good morning. My name is Mike Renick. I am the senior broker, the team lead with Team Renick Real Estate Services. We're part of that great Keller Williams on the Water family, serving Sarasota, Bradenton, the islands, in fact, the entire west coast of Florida. Welcome to the November 7th edition of Title Time with Mike and Mike. My guest today, as it is every Wednesday morning, is Michael Hankin. I've got a nice bio, and I get in trouble when I read that all the time. It's accurate. But let me just say this about Mike. He's a great guy. I'm honored to have him part of our Wednesday shows. His knowledge and his willingness to share it is second to none, and he's an outstanding local attorney. So with that said, let me bring Mike up into the live broadcast. Michael, good morning. Did I do better?
Good morning, Mike. Thank you so much for finally shortening that. I appreciate it.
Hey, we try to help out every once in a while. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And as my former partner, David Person, used to say, doing well by doing good.
Excellent. I like that. Very good. So today we're going to talk about fees that are incurred during a real estate transaction. Is that correct?
That is. I wanted to talk about one of the items which really causes, I think, the greatest amount of apprehension with buyers and sellers, and that's how much is this really going to cost me, or how much am I really going to have deducted from my sales price to have the transaction completed. So starting off, if we're going to look at, say, just buyers, and if a buyer's paying cash, what sort of expenses can a buyer expect to incur? The typical, and for today's purposes, we're going to do the typical allocation of costs between buyers and sellers in Sarasota. Of course, everything in life is negotiable, so any of these things can be shifted to the buyer or the seller's side, even though this is not the default. But today we'll be talking about, as I mentioned, just the default on how these things are normally allocated in a transaction here in Sarasota. So beginning off, a buyer in Sarasota would expect to pay for the recording of the deed, which is a per page charge. Typically it's 1 to 2 pages, and it's less than $20 usually. Buyers should expect to pay for their home inspections. And on a single family residence, they could be looking at anywhere between $350 and $500 for a generalized home inspection. There's other things that may go with that. You want a buyer generally will expect to pay for a pest inspection, where they're looking for termites. Also, if the home inspection raised any other flags, there may be additional inspections like roof inspections or pool inspections, septic inspections, and so on that a buyer would also expect to pay for. A buyer would also normally pay for the cost of a survey if it's a single family as opposed to a condo. Surveys for a normal platted lot in Sarasota are usually $300 to $400. If a buyer should expect to pay for insurance as well, both homeowners insurance or condos insurance, depending on the type of improvement, and flood insurance as well if they're in a flood zone or would just like flood insurance. It's a lot of fees so far, and I'm sad to say we're not quite done yet. If the property is in a HOA or a condominium, and the HOA or condominium association charges a transfer fee, that's also generally paid for by the buyer. Usually those are about $100 to $250. Now, if a buyer's paying cash, luckily they're pretty close to done right now. There'll be some prorations of other items, but as for costs, they should be done. If a buyer is instead getting a mortgage on the property, there's more costs. There's the recording of the mortgage, which is a per page charge. Usually that's around $150 to $200, depending on the length of the mortgage. There are taxes and recording fees on the promissory note and the mortgage, which are in Florida 0.55% of the mortgage amount. So if you have a $100,000 mortgage, you have $550 worth of taxes. You'll have lender's fees. which can consist of appraisal fees, mortgage insurance, application processing, underwriting fees, credit reporting fees, tax service fees, flood certification fees, lots of different items. The best place to really get a full itemization of those lender fees is on the loan estimate form that you get from your lender. And that's one of the first things that you should ask for. That'll give you a good itemization of those fees, which do vary from lender to lender. Your lender, if you're getting a loan, will also have an escrow for taxes and insurance, which is additional funds that are put into an escrow account at the time of closing. Those can be a significant dollar figure, so it's good to get a decent estimate from your lender for that amount up front. It's hard to give you a ballpark estimate because taxes differ from property to property, and depending on the time of year, the amount you put into that escrow would vary. And then the last major item that a buyer would pay for is title insurance. Title insurance has several different fees which comprise the total title insurance cost. There's a closing fee. Our fee for closings are $350. There's a title search fee. Our underwriter charges $85. And then an owner's policy of title insurance fee, which is generally around 0.5% of the purchase price. In addition, there's a municipal lien search fee, which is $125 for us. Now, you should know different title agents do charge different amounts of money for closing fees and title search fees. Generally, the differences are very minimal between title agents and attorneys. And in our experience, our closing fee and other closing related fees are less than our competition. We really do try to make this process as inexpensive and as competitive as possible. So that is it in the world of buyer's expenses. Now, if you're a seller, you should expect to have some of your own expenses. And we'll begin with the largest, which is the documentary tax on the deed. In Florida and all places other than Miami-Dade, it is 0.7% of the purchase price. So that's a big dollar figure. If you sell your property for $100,000, as a seller, you're going to pay $700 in taxes. If your property is part of an HOA or a condominium association, that HOA or condominium association is likely going to charge what's called an estoppel fee for providing information about the payment of the dues and any outstanding special assessments to the title agent. Usually they charge $250 for that. If the seller has agreed to pay the owner's policy and the title insurance charges, they'll see those charges I mentioned before, the $350, the $85, and the 0.5% of the purchase price for the title related expenses. As we've discussed in other videos, I really think that should be a buyer's expense. It's something that the buyer should want to control who handles and does the actual closing services. And we've discussed that in other videos, so I won't get too off topic. A seller should also expect to pay any expenses needed to cure the title. So if there's a problem that necessitates getting a variance from the association or approaching the county to get a variance or an encroachment agreement into an easement, for instance, the expenses associated with doing that would be the seller's expense. So the seller's got to hire an attorney or hire a notary or whatever's required. That is usually a seller's expense in the standard form purchase contract. Real estate commissions, of course, are typically a seller's expense. Any broker processing charges are typically seller's expenses. If a seller is a foreigner, they'll have a withholding of 15% of their sales price unless certain expenses or certain exceptions present themselves. And in addition, there'll be some charges for prorations of taxes depending on what time of year the closing occurs. and proration of rents and security deposits if the property's rented. It's a lot of information, Mike. I hope I didn't put you to sleep there. Any
No,
questions? What do you think?
actually, what you're demonstrating is another factor of how complex the real estate process is. And what we do is we sit down with our buyer or seller, depending which side of the table we're on for that transaction, and we estimate all of these fees. And we take that into account before, if we're the buyer side, before we make that initial offer. So what we share is there's three prices: a seller desired, well, we know what that is, that's a listing price. There's a market value, heck, that's easy to calculate and show with the market data. Then there's a buyer desired, what's the value of this to the buyer? On top of that mix, you throw in the fees so that we can make an intelligent first offer and continue forward, hopefully to the finish line where our side is happy. And of course, the other side accepts it. That means they're happy. So we know these within a range right up front, and we use that in our negotiations without signaling these out to the other party. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. And it's important to know what you're getting into before you get into it. So it's always a great idea to have a good understanding of the fees that should be incurred. So hopefully this video does that. And the way it sounds like you do it really gives your clients a good idea as to the amount that they should expect when they get into it, so there's no surprises at the end. Really, I feel like information helps to ease people's anxieties in the transactions. And I think the way you practice in these videos really helps to do that. So I hope we keep up the good work.
No, I appreciate that. It's about transparency, laying everything out up front, trying to minimize or eliminate any kind of surprises. It's imperative that everyone walk away at a closing feeling that they got a very good deal. The key is, though, the buyer wants to pay the least amount. I get that, I respect that, and we work towards that. When I'm on the seller side, of course, we want the highest amount. I get that, I respect that, and we work towards that. But ultimately, until the buyer and seller come together, including the fees, and they find out who goes, how much comes out of the buyer side, how much goes in, to the seller, until that number is known, you really can't do a good job of negotiations, and you can't keep everyone happy.
I'd agree. I mean, really, without this information, you're negotiating in the blind. And a seller can't really, I think, knowingly and properly agree to a number, or a buyer knowingly and properly agree to an offer price without having all the numbers. $100,000 offer doesn't mean $100,000 at closing, either as a check from the buyer or a check to the seller. And knowing that going in helps to get rid of the concerns and issues that arise later. So I think it's a good thing.
Michael, another outstanding job. Any last minute thoughts before we move on?
No, I think it's a great addition this week, and look forward to next week.
Mike, again, I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. It's always appreciated, and I will see you next Wednesday morning.
Thanks, Mike. See you then.
Take care. Thank you.